The trading floor erupted in chaos as the ticker screens turned red, each number plummeting like a death sentence. Michael Harrington said, "This cannot be happening, not today." His empire, built with calculated risk and unwavering faith, now cracked before his eyes. The voices of brokers swirled in panic while phones rang endlessly, the sound of wealth collapsing in real time. Across the glass boardroom, Catherine Langford whispered, "It looks like someone pulled the plug from inside." Her words carried suspicion sharper than any blade. In the shadows of the skyline, Daniel Mercer stood silent, his calm gaze betraying knowledge of secrets yet untold. The collapse had no warning, no mercy, just destruction sweeping like fire across fortunes. Michael felt the betrayal heavier than the loss of billions, for trust once shattered leaves scars money cannot heal. The world outside carried on, but within these walls, lives were already ruined. The scandal had been born in silence, and now it screamed across the financial world. The city outside thrived as if untouched, but inside the tower, Michael Harrington's voice cracked with disbelief. "Decades of trust ruined in an hour," he whispered as Catherine Langford stood stiff, her hand resting on the glass. The betrayal smelled of precision, not chance, for losses like these were orchestrated with surgical cruelty. Daniel Mercer lingered in silence, his calm presence unsettling, as though waiting for the perfect storm. The trading floor had gone from thunder to eerie quiet, the silence heavier than chaos. Michael stared at the monitors, each line downward an insult to his years of labor. Catherine said, "If we do not find the hand behind this, it will bury us deeper than debt." She searched his face for strength, but all she found was a man unraveling. The fall was not only financial but personal, and the scandal had only just begun its march toward the world's attention. As silence spread, the traders dispersed like shadows, leaving only fragments of broken ambition on the floor. Michael Harrington whispered, "It was someone I trusted." The words were meant for no one, yet Catherine Langford caught them like daggers. She moved closer, saying, "If you know who it is, name them before the city does it for you." His hands shook as he reached for a glass of water, the surface rippling with his doubt. Daniel Mercer's gaze did not move, and his stillness grew heavier than words. Outside, storm clouds thickened, echoing the turmoil inside. The building seemed smaller now, crushed by invisible weight. This was not a misstep, but sabotage at its cruelest. The scandal had found its players, but its stage had only just been lit. The storm broke across the city with rain pelting glass walls, thunder echoing like a financial drumbeat. Michael Harrington finally stood tall, his suit damp from spilled water, saying, "This isn't chance, it's betrayal." Catherine Langford replied, "Then we are already fighting ghosts." Daniel Mercer adjusted his cufflinks, saying nothing, yet his silence carved more tension than any accusation. The city lights blurred against raindrops, painting streaks of red and gold across the floor. This was not merely business collapsing, it was trust dissolving like ink in storm water. Every empire begins with faith, and tonight, Michael's had crumbled at the hands of betrayal too calculated to forgive. The scandal was alive, and its breath chilled the very air. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with silence heavy as stone. Michael Harrington stared across the table at Catherine Langford, who asked, "Will you fight or fold?" He turned to Daniel Mercer, searching for reaction, but the man offered only a thin smile, neither ally nor enemy revealed. The scandal had only placed its first card on the table, but the game promised ruin for the unprepared. The city hummed beyond the storm, oblivious to fortunes evaporating in the tower above. Michael whispered to himself, "Everything we built may already be gone." Betrayal had arrived not with a shout, but with whispers, and the world would soon hear them roar. The rain had ceased, but the storm within Michael Harrington only grew stronger. He walked through the empty boardroom, his steps echoing like reminders of a collapsing empire. Catherine Langford said, "You must face the world before the world buries you." He turned, his voice breaking. "They trusted me, Catherine, and now I stand accused of destroying it all." Daniel Mercer lingered near the door, his silence stretching into accusation itself. The scandal was no longer contained in hushed tones. Reporters gathered outside, hungry for blood. Catherine's gaze cut through the room, fierce and unyielding. She said, "If you want survival, you must show them strength, not sorrow." Michael swallowed, every word she spoke weighing heavier than truth. He stared at Daniel, whose faint smile remained unnerving, as though he knew far more than he let on. The financial underdog was cornered, and only fire would determine if he rose or was consumed. Outside the tower, chaos brewed as cameras flashed in the cold morning air. Reporters shouted questions no one dared answer. Inside, Michael Harrington whispered, "I built everything on loyalty, and still betrayal found me." Catherine Langford placed her hand on his shoulder, steady yet forceful, saying, "Then rebuild it with fear and truth." Daniel Mercer adjusted his tie, adding, "Survival is not for the honest, Michael, but for the ruthless." The words hung like poison in the air. Michael's heart beat against the weight of expectation, every second narrowing his chances. His empire had fallen in numbers, but now his reputation was on trial. Betrayal was no longer hidden, it became public spectacle, a wound displayed to a nation eager for spectacle. The fallen financial guru arrived in shadows, his face older and lined with regret. Edward Wallace stepped forward saying, "Michael, the system will never forgive weakness." He was once a titan, now a mentor fallen to disgrace. Michael Harrington asked, "If strength is the only language, then what cost is left to pay?" Catherine Langford's eyes narrowed, unwilling to trust Edward fully. Daniel Mercer smirked slightly, watching the two men like a predator circling prey. Edward's voice softened, "You either embrace their rules, or you drown beneath them." Michael's chest tightened with the weight of choice. The mentor's words were born from ruin, a warning carved from experience. Betrayal had broken him once, and his scars bled into every syllable. The financial maze demanded cruelty, and Michael's fate now rested on how much of his soul he was willing to surrender. The city hummed beneath them, but Michael Harrington's focus remained caged within his battle. Catherine Langford said, "This is more than numbers, Michael. It's survival against those who thrive on ruin." Edward Wallace's hand trembled as he poured whiskey, muttering, "I once thought I could beat them too." Daniel Mercer leaned casually against the wall, his presence sharp as steel. Michael stood straighter, whispering, "Then I must face them before they finish me." The night outside glowed with neon and storm mist, painting symbols of fate across the glass. Betrayal circled them like wolves, unseen but certain. Edward's weary eyes locked with Michael's, warning him of the cost of false allies. Catherine's voice cut through, "You must choose whether you rise with power or fall with dignity." The choice had never felt more cruel or more final. The underdog within Michael Harrington cracked yet hardened all at once. He clenched his fists, voice echoing across the silent office. "They wanted my collapse, but they will choke on their betrayal." Catherine Langford's eyes flickered with fire, saying, "Then let us prepare for war." Edward Wallace lowered his gaze, whispering, "War cost me everything once." Daniel Mercer only smiled faintly, his silence a mask that concealed intent. The hour had shifted. No longer the broken man, Michael now stood at the edge of transformation. His path was carved not in fortune, but in vengeance and survival. Outside, the city pulsed with light, unaware that its next great scandal was about to burst open. Betrayal had destroyed a fortune, but it might yet build an empire reborn in shadows. The press had turned frenzy into fire, their words sharper than markets. Michael Harrington walked past flashing bulbs, every step a reminder of lost faith. Catherine Langford whispered, "They smell blood, and they want more." Edward Wallace muttered, "This is only the beginning of the storm." Daniel Mercer remained silent, his calm gaze fixed ahead, almost feeding on the chaos. Michael clenched his jaw, whispering, "The betrayal came from within, and yet I walk the stage of blame alone." Reporters shouted accusations, each one slicing at his dignity. Catherine's voice cut through, "Then we must give them something louder than scandal, Michael." The streets seemed to pulse with the rhythm of downfall, and every second dragged him closer to collapse. The empire had cracked, but now the world demanded his ruin. Inside the marble courthouse lobby, the silence weighed heavier than the storm outside. Michael Harrington said, "If trust is dead, then only truth can save me." Catherine Langford gripped his arm, whispering, "Truth is too fragile here, Michael. It bends to whoever holds the gavel." Edward Wallace sighed deeply, saying, "This place does not deal in justice, only power." Daniel Mercer adjusted his cufflinks, watching as though he had already written the outcome. The echoes of footsteps across marble reminded Michael of his own fragility. Betrayal had shattered numbers, but here it shattered identity. Each word of accusation would etch into legacy, not just finances. The game was no longer markets, it was survival against perception. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, anticipation dripping from every whisper. Michael Harrington sat at the long oak table, his hands clenched. Catherine Langford leaned close, whispering, "Every eye is waiting for your fall." Edward Wallace rubbed his forehead, muttering, "This place devours the weak." Daniel Mercer remained still, his faint smile slicing through the air like unseen proof. The judge entered, gavel striking with thunderous weight, and the gallery erupted in silence. Michael's heart pounded with every accusation read aloud. He whispered under his breath, "I must find the one who sold me out before they bury me alive." Betrayal was no longer hidden in numbers. It now wore the cloak of law. The first witness took the stand, a former ally turned enemy. Michael Harrington's chest tightened as the man accused him of deceit. Catherine Langford whispered, "This is planted, Michael. Someone choreographed every word." Edward Wallace gritted his teeth, saying, "I've seen men ruined on lies more believable than truth." Daniel Mercer leaned back, his smile now almost cruel. Michael stared at the witness, whispering to himself, "Trust was the currency I traded, and now it bankrupts me." The jury's eyes weighed him down like anchors, each glance filled with suspicion. Betrayal had moved from whispers to testimony, sharpening itself into daggers of words. The session ended in silence, but the damage had been carved deep. Michael Harrington rose slowly, his voice shaking as he said, "If this is justice, then betrayal has already won." Catherine Langford's hand pressed firmly on his shoulder, whispering, "This fight is not finished." Edward Wallace muttered, "The system is a serpent. It coils tighter the more you resist." Daniel Mercer walked ahead, his calm steps echoing across the hall like a victor already crowned. Outside the courthouse, reporters awaited, hungry for collapse. The day had turned darker than the storm, and Michael's future now hung by threads woven from lies. Betrayal was not only alive, it ruled. The courthouse emptied, but secrets refused to rest. Michael Harrington sat in the dim office, head bowed, whispers of betrayal clawing at him. Catherine Langford broke the silence, saying, "We cannot fight shadows without light." Edward Wallace poured another drink, muttering, "Light exposes, but it also blinds." Daniel Mercer leaned against the wall, smirk sharpening as though waiting for the right moment to strike. Michael whispered, "It wasn't the markets, it wasn't the judges, it was someone I trusted most." The revelation cracked across the room like thunder, suspicion shifting toward those closest. Catherine's eyes narrowed, her breath tight. Edward turned away, his shame carved deeper. Daniel only smiled, for truth was finally crawling to the surface, ready to pierce the last veil of loyalty. The silence broke with Catherine Langford slamming her hand on the table, saying, "Someone fed them the numbers, Michael. It wasn't chance, it was betrayal." Edward Wallace staggered back, glass spilling, as though guilt had reached him. Michael's chest heaved, his voice shaking. "Tell me it wasn't you, Edward." Edward's trembling lips spoke, "I warned you about this world, but I never handed you over." Daniel Mercer's eyes glistened with quiet amusement, whispering, "The truth is always less about who did it, and more about who profits." The weight of betrayal shifted through the room, suspicion changing shape with every word. The scandal was no longer smoke, it was fire devouring them all. The storm outside returned, lightning cracking across the skyline as truth began to surface. Michael Harrington said, "Betrayal came from someone who knew the system too well." Catherine Langford stepped closer, whispering, "That narrows it to those closest to you." Edward Wallace dropped into his chair, muttering, "I lost everything already. Do not hang this on me." Daniel Mercer finally spoke, his words cold. "Perhaps betrayal isn't about weakness, but about vision. Some of us see the fall before it comes." Michael's glare burned into him, yet his certainty faltered. The room pulsed with suspicion, and for the first time, the betrayer's mask seemed closer to falling. The phone rang, its shrill echo cutting through the storm. Catherine Langford answered, her expression hardening as she listened. She turned to Michael Harrington, saying, "The numbers didn't leak from outside. It came from your inner circle." Edward Wallace slammed his glass down, shouting, "I have nothing left to betray." Daniel Mercer smirked, replying softly, "Sometimes betrayal is not about loss, but gain." Michael's voice cracked, "Then the knife was always in the room with us." Suspicion flared brighter, each word tearing through the fragile bonds that held them together. The scandal's core had finally been pierced, but the truth would not come gently, it would come like a blade. The revelation arrived like lightning, splitting the night. Catherine Langford whispered, "It was someone we trusted most. The betrayal is closer than you imagine." Michael Harrington staggered back, every breath sharp as knives. Edward Wallace covered his face, broken by accusation though guilt was unproven. Daniel Mercer's smirk widened, his silence more damning than words. Michael said, "Then the empire was destroyed not by strangers but by family." The word family echoed like a curse, twisting the scandal into something personal, intimate, devastating. The storm outside wailed against the glass, as though the city itself mourned the loss of loyalty. In that moment, betrayal no longer felt financial. It felt like blood poisoning the very heart of trust. The storm of betrayal had now become a war of survival. Michael Harrington stood in his private office, the skyline burning with neon outside, as Catherine Langford said, "The board is calling for your resignation tomorrow." Edward Wallace shook his head, whispering, "They want you to kneel, but kneeling will not save you." Daniel Mercer leaned against the glass, his smile like a dagger, saying nothing yet speaking everything. Michael clenched his fists, whispering, "If they want me gone, then I'll risk everything on one last gamble." Catherine's eyes widened in disbelief, replying, "This could destroy you beyond repair." Edward muttered, "Or it could crown you in ruin's ashes." The air thickened with dread, as Michael prepared to confront betrayal with fire, knowing only one of them would survive the storm. The next morning, the boardroom became a battlefield. Michael Harrington entered in silence, the weight of scandal trailing behind. Catherine Langford walked with him, whispering, "Every chair here is an enemy tonight." Edward Wallace followed, muttering, "They will circle like vultures." Daniel Mercer sat already at the table, calm, his papers neatly stacked like a victory prepared. The chairman read accusations of fraud, whispers filling the air like poison. Michael rose to speak, his voice steady. "I built this empire with loyalty, and someone here turned it into betrayal." The board shifted uncomfortably, suspicion spreading like wildfire. The war was no longer hidden, it was open, and it would consume them all. As accusations burned, Michael Harrington slammed his hand on the table, declaring, "If betrayal came from inside, then I will drag it into light." Catherine Langford whispered, "Careful, they want you broken." Edward Wallace coughed, muttering, "The truth here will cost more than lies ever will." Daniel Mercer leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp. "Sometimes betrayal is just the price of ambition, Michael." The board fell silent, every word Daniel spoke cutting deeper. Michael glared at him, suspicion turning into clarity, but the proof remained a shadow. Betrayal was no longer a whisper, it was a blade, and it was being wielded in plain sight. The meeting spiraled into chaos. Board members shouted, some calling for resignation, others whispering about hidden deals. Catherine Langford stood shouting, "This is no collapse, it is sabotage." Edward Wallace raised his glass, bitter laughter spilling as he muttered, "I warned you all, the system eats its own." Daniel Mercer remained calm, his silence heavier than the storm outside. Michael Harrington's voice cracked. "This betrayal was crafted to ruin me, but it will not end here." The air burned with conflict, suspicion turning into open war within the room. Every loyalty fractured, every face a mask. The scandal had reached its boiling point, and the collapse of trust was now absolute. As silence returned, the war reached its sharpest moment. Michael Harrington leaned across the table, his voice cutting like steel. "The betrayal was orchestrated by someone who profits from my destruction." Catherine Langford gripped his arm, whispering, "Then call their name, Michael Todowo." Edward Wallace muttered, "Every empire dies from within." Daniel Mercer leaned back, his smirk widening into a predator's grin. Michael's heart thundered as he stared into Daniel's eyes, whispering, "It was you all along." The board gasped, the truth finally clawing its way out. Betrayal had a face now, and the war for survival had found its enemy. The boardroom emptied into silence, but the echoes of accusation still clung to the air like smoke. Michael Harrington remained standing, staring at the chair where Daniel Mercer had sat, the smirk carved into his memory. Catherine Langford said softly, "Now the world knows who stands against you." Edward Wallace muttered, "Knowing the traitor does not save you, the damage is done." Michael's voice broke, "Betrayal takes wealth, but worse, it takes faith." Catherine leaned closer, whispering, "Then fight with what remains, your name." Edward's weary eyes glistened with regret, as though seeing his own failures reflected in Michael's fall. Outside, the storm subsided, but within, the war raged louder. The scandal was now public, the empire shattered, and survival was the only prize left to claim. Reporters swarmed outside the tower as dawn broke, their voices rising like vultures circling the ruins. Michael Harrington exited the building, Catherine Langford at his side, her chin lifted defiantly. Cameras flashed as questions were hurled. One shouted, "Did you betray your investors?" Michael stopped, his voice steady but heavy. "Betrayal destroyed my fortune, but not my resolve." Edward Wallace muttered from behind, "Words are fragile shields, Michael. They break too easily." Catherine whispered, "Then sharpen them into weapons." The flashbulbs burned brighter, the crowd hungry for collapse. In that moment, Michael no longer stood as a titan. He stood as a man stripped bare, facing the storm without armor. Inside the dim office later that evening, Michael Harrington collapsed into his chair, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Catherine Langford said, "You still have allies. They fear Daniel Mercer as much as you." Edward Wallace poured a drink, muttering, "Fear builds no foundations, it only delays collapse." Michael raised his head slowly, whispering, "Then I must gamble what little remains." Catherine's eyes flared with urgency, saying, "This gamble could destroy the last thread of your reputation." Edward's laugh cracked like glass. "Reputation is already gone." Michael closed his eyes, the weight of betrayal now a shadow on his chest, knowing the next move would decide whether he rose or was buried. The news spread across television screens. Daniel Mercer hailed as the man who saved the empire by exposing fraud, his lies painted as truth. Michael Harrington stared at the screen, fury burning, whispering, "He turned betrayal into victory." Catherine Langford clenched her fists, saying, "Then take back the story, expose him for what he is." Edward Wallace shook his head, whispering, "He owns the narrative now. Once the world believes, truth is powerless." Michael rose from his chair, his voice filled with steel. "Then I will make them see." The scandal no longer belonged to numbers or courts. It belonged to whoever sees the story. And Michael was ready to fight for his. Night fell heavy as Michael Harrington stood at the window, city lights flickering like distant embers. Catherine Langford placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Tomorrow begins the real war." Edward Wallace muttered from behind, "War only ends in ashes, Michael. Make sure you can live with them." Michael's voice was steady. "If betrayal built his throne, then truth will shatter it." The skyline stretched vast before him, storm clouds rolling again as if the city itself braced for another collapse. The scandal had torn everything apart, yet within the ruins stood one man unwilling to surrender. His empire may be gone, but his fight was only beginning. The city awakened to headlines of collapse, Daniel Mercer framed as savior, and Michael Harrington painted as villain. Michael stood by the window, watching his empire reduced to ink on paper. Catherine Langford whispered, "They have written your ending for you." Edward Wallace muttered, "Stories are stronger than truth, and once told, they spread like wildfire." Michael's voice cut through, "Then I will write mine with actions they cannot erase." Catherine's eyes glimmered with defiance, saying, "Then let us strike while betrayal still burns." Edward shook his head, weary but resigned, as the storm outside gathered once again. Michael clenched his fists, knowing this was not only about money, but redemption. Michael Harrington faced Catherine Langford and Edward Wallace with a plan burning in his voice. "If Daniel Mercer builds his power on lies, then truth must rip it apart." Catherine replied sharply, "Then we must expose the numbers he buried." Edward said, "Truth is dangerous when spoken too late." Michael stared at him, whispering, "Then it must be spoken now, even if it costs everything." Catherine placed her hand firmly on his shoulder, saying, "Then, let us go into war together." Edward sighed, pouring one final glass, knowing that every war demanded its sacrifices. The press conference room swelled with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning. Michael Harrington walked to the podium, Catherine Langford at his side, Edward Wallace behind him, tired but present. The crowd roared accusations. Michael's voice rose above them, steady. "Betrayal destroyed my fortune, but not the truth. Daniel Mercer crafted this collapse." The room fell into a storm of questions, flashes, and whispers. Catherine whispered fiercely, "You've turned the tide. Hold it steady." Edward muttered, "Unspoken words can never be taken back." The battle had moved from boardrooms to the world stage, and there was no retreat. Daniel Mercer stepped into the same stage hours later, his smile confident, his lies flowing like honey. "I saved this empire from collapse," he declared. Michael Harrington watched from the shadows, fists tightening. Catherine Langford whispered, "He is twisting every word." Edward Wallace muttered bitterly, "The world crowns liars when they dress in charm." Michael's voice trembled, "Then I will not let him finish the story." The stage was now a battlefield, not of weapons, but of voices. Truth and betrayal collided under the same lights, and only one would survive the weight of history. Night fell, leaving the city drowned in silence after the storm of words. Michael Harrington stood alone on the rooftop, rain soaking his suit, his face a mixture of pain and defiance. Catherine Langford joined him, whispering, "You did not fall, you made them see." Edward Wallace remained below, haunted by ghosts of his own downfall. Michael's voice echoed into the night, "A fortune can be rebuilt, but betrayal never heals." Lightning flashed, illuminating his figure against the skyline. The scandal had taken everything, but it could not take his resolve. His empire was ashes, but in those ashes the fire of truth still burned.